Imagine handing your unlocked phone to a total stranger.
Oh man, no thank you.
Right. But imagine you do it. You tell them to physically walk across the country, brave wild animals, bandits, whatever. And when they finally arrive, weeks later, you trust them to just read your most intimate text messages aloud to a crowd of people.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
It does. But, today, going viral or, like, maintaining a network means just tapping a piece of glass in your pocket. But in the late antique world, long before the internet, communication required a completely different kind of machinery.
A much more human machinery, yeah.
Exactly. So today, we are taking a deep dive into an extraordinary stack of material covering the birth of global networking. And we're looking at this massively wealthy power couple who literally gave everything they owned away.
Yeah, it's a wild story.
We are exploring the lives of Paulinus and Therasia of Nola. And we'll see how they used the perilous complex system of ancient letter writing to really shape the early Christian world.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how they achieved this massive cultural influence, we first have to understand who they were before they gave it all up.
Right, because they weren't just anybody. Paulinus and Therasia were, they were the ultimate political insiders.
Like top of the food chain.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you look at Paulinus's early life, he basically had a golden ticket. He was born in Gaul, what we now call France, in the year 324. And he was born into this highly connected, noble Roman family.
He was a brilliant lawyer, right, a public official. I mean, if things had gone according to plan, he was on the absolute fast track to becoming a tremendously wealthy, standard-issue Roman senator.
He really had the entire map laid out in front of him. And that trajectory, it only accelerated when he married Therasia.
Right. She was a devout Christian aristocrat from Spain, and she brought with her an immense fortune. I mean, historical records from the era describe her as a woman of, quote, irreproachable character.
Which is great.
But practically speaking, yeah, her wealth is what truly underwrote their early life together. Yeah. They owned these vast, sprawling estates across the entire empire.
And she ends up being a massive influence on him spiritually, doesn't she?
She does, yeah. By the year 389, largely because of Theresia's guidance, Paulinus officially converts to Christianity.
So they're living this incredibly affluent, comfortable life in Spain. But then they hit this devastating turning point. They have a son named Celsus. And tragically, Celsus dies when he is just 8 days old.
Yeah. And that kind of profound, agonizing personal tragedy, it completely shatters whatever roadmap you thought your life was following.
It changes everything.
Exactly. Following the death of Celsus, they don't just mourn in private. They radically alter their entire existence by embracing a strict ascetic life, meaning they completely strip away all worldly comforts. They take vows of poverty and extreme self-denial.
And when we say they embraced it, we aren't talking about, downsizing to a smaller villa.
Oh, no.
They liquidated everything. They sold off their vast estates across the empire.
But
let's pause on that, because you can't just, hit sell on an app in the 4th century.
Right. It's not a quick wire transfer.
How do you even liquidate a multinational real estate portfolio back then?
It was a massive logistical undertaking. We are talking about selling thousands of acres of land, dealing with property managers, navigating imperial tax codes, and literally physically moving tons of grain, goods, and gold.
That sounds exhausting.
It was. The sheer volume of wealth they liquidated and gave away to the poor was so staggering that St. Jerome, who was a major figure at the time, he openly marveled that their charity literally flooded both the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire.
Just incredible scale.
Yeah, and after this massive divestment, they packed up and moved to a monastic life in Nola, which is a town in the Campania region near Naples, Italy.
It's the ultimate career pivot. But I do have to push back a little here.
Okay, go for it.
Because it's tempting to compare this to, a modern former president or a tech billionaire liquidating a global empire, giving every cent to the public and moving into a cave in the woods.
Sure.
But they didn't just disappear into obscurity, did they? By giving up their political titles and their cash, it seems like they actually gained, more power. How does that even work?
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, you've hit on the exact paradox of late antiquity.
Okay.
In a Roman Empire that was notoriously corrupt, where political office was, often bought and sold, voluntary poverty was the ultimate proof of an unbribable character.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Right. By stepping outside the traditional Roman hierarchy of wealth and status, Paulinus and Therasia gained a completely new kind of social and moral capital. They were no longer viewed as self-interested politicians.
They were above it all.
Exactly. They were seen as holy, detached, and pure. And, ironically, that elevated status made the greatest philosophical and theological minds of the time want their advice and partnership even more.
Which makes sense psychologically. You
Yeah.
trust the person who has absolutely nothing to lose.
Exactly.
But practically speaking, if they're isolated in a monastery in Nola, how do they actually maintain those relationships? I mean, they didn't take a vow of silence.
Far from it. They wrote constantly. Paulinus became famous for being this delightful, charming correspondent, and Therasia was actually St. Augustine's very first female correspondent.
That's amazing. But their output was staggering, right?
It was, and we really need to dive into the physical mechanics of ancient letter writing to appreciate what that meant.
Because it wasn't just sitting quietly with a journal.
Not at all. Writing wasn't a solitary, quiet activity. The physical labor of writing was exhausting. You were usually dictating to highly trained secretaries or enslaved people.
Right, because they used a specific kind of shorthand, didn't they?
Yes, Roman shorthand. It's often called Tyronian notes. It was this really complex system of symbols that allowed a scribe to keep up with human speech.
Like ancient stenographers.
Exactly. We actually have a letter from St. Jerome where he complains bitterly about dictating a massive 13-page document in the middle of the night.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was talking so fast by the light of one tiny expensive oil lamp that his tongue outstripped his secretary's pens. He totally baffled their shorthand tricks. It was chaotic, loud, and incredibly pressured.
Not to mention the materials. We take paper for granted, but they were using like wax tablets for drafts.
Right, wooden boards filled with wax.
You'd scratch out your thoughts in the wax, and sometimes you'd actually send that tablet to a friend. And then they would read it, literally smooth the wax over with a specialized tool, and write their reply right over your old message.
It was the ancient version of a collaborative document, a shared Google Doc.
Yeah. But for permanent formal letters, they had to use papyrus or parchment.
Papyrus was cheaper, but it had serious supply chain issues. In fact, we have surviving letters where wealthy aristocrats use, quote, papyrus shortages as a
Okay.
convenient face-saving excuse for why they haven't written back to someone.
The ancient equivalent of, sorry, my phone died.
Literally, they were just ghosting people.
I love that. But writing the letter wasn't even the hardest part. It was the delivery system. Because the Roman Empire had this incredibly sophisticated postal service called the cursus publicus.
Yes, very efficient.
But that was strictly reserved for official state business. Even a highly respected bishop or a former politician couldn't just drop personal mail into the imperial system.
No. So they relied entirely on private bearers. You had to find someone traveling in the right direction, a merchant, a monk, a friend, and just hand them your deeply personal thoughts.
And hope for the best.
Pretty much. These bearers were often referred to as living and intelligent letters. They weren't just couriers handing over a scroll. They were expected to verbally expand on the letter.
Right. Answer questions, convey the emotional tone.
Exactly. And they might travel for weeks on foot through dangerous terrain or take perilous, totally unpredictable sea voyages just to deliver the message.
Wait, hold on. If I am handing my most private, intimate correspondence to a random merchant who is walking across Europe, what about forgery?
Oh, yeah.
Like, what if the bearer is robbed? Or worse, what if they secretly hate me and alter the message? Wasn't identity theft a massive risk?
It was a huge source of anxiety. The fear of lost letters, tampering, and immense delays just jumps off the pages of these ancient texts.
I can imagine.
To give you a sense of the timeline, there is a famous instance where one letter from Augustine in North Africa to Jerome in Bethlehem took 9 years to arrive.
9 years.
9 years. It spent nearly a decade bouncing around Italy before finally crossing the Mediterranean.
That is absurd.
It is. So to combat the risk of forgery and to prove the letter was genuinely from them, they instituted a system of authentication through gifts. A letter almost never traveled alone.
The gifts are such a fascinating workaround. Because Augustine once sent Paulinus and Therasia a loaf of bread, right? Intended for the Eucharist, the central Christian communion ritual, to symbolize their spiritual unity.
Right.
And in return, Paulinus and Therasia sent a friend a literal splinter of the true cross, which they had acquired through their vast network. It created this entire economy of relics and meaningful objects acting as, like, wax seals of authenticity.
And it started with deep spiritual meaning. Though, to be fair, over the centuries, this gift-giving arms race escalated to total absurdities. Later historical records show bishops and aristocrats sending each other elaborate water clocks, highly trained exotic animals like elephants, or even imported rotten fish as delicacies to prove their wealth and verify their letters.
Okay, sending an elephant through the mail just to prove you wrote a letter is incredible.
Yeah, flex.
It really is. But the sheer friction of this system raises a question. If the mail was this unreliable, this stressful, and required a 9-year lead time, why put so much effort into it? Was it just a status symbol?
Well, what's fascinating here is how they viewed the physical object of the letter itself. Today, a text message is just data transfer, right?
Yeah, ones and zeros.
But in late antiquity, the physical parchment was viewed as an actual literal extension of the sender's own body. One of Paulinus's peers wrote that people who couldn't travel to see Paulinus in person would weep just touching his letters.
Wow.
Holding that parchment meant holding something his hands had touched weeks or months ago. It bridged the physical gap of the empire and made sending these texts a deeply intimate act of spiritual bonding.
That reframes the whole concept entirely. The letter isn't just the message. The letter is the person.
Yes.
So we have this massive international network built on parchment, sea voyages, and intense patience. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because while they are corresponding with the global heavyweights, physically, Paulinus and Therasia are completely obsessed with their local zip code in Nola. Specifically, they dedicated enormous energy to the cult of a local martyr named St. Felix.
Yes. Paulinus had a childhood devotion to Felix. Even back when he was a wealthy Roman official, he had used his political clout to build a paved road and a hospice just to make it easier for people to go on pilgrimage to Felix's shrine.
But once he moves to Nola and becomes an ascetic, he goes into absolute overdrive. He starts writing these annual epic poems called the Natalitia.
Yep.
And they were meant to be performed aloud every year on January 14th, the feast day of St. Felix. And the stories in these poems, they read like ancient action movies.
They really do. They recount the life of Felix during a period of intense, violent Roman persecution of Christians. Paulinus understood that to captivate an audience, you need dramatic narrative.
He recounts how Felix miraculously escaped from a locked prison. Then Felix wanders into the wilderness and finds this weakened, starving bishop named Maximus and essentially nurses him back to health.
Right.
But the best story, by far, is the hideout. Felix is on the run from Roman soldiers. He ducks into the ruins of an old building, and immediately a spider drops down and spins a massive, intricate web right across the doorway.
It's so cinematic.
It is. The soldiers run up, they look at the undisturbed spider web, and conclude that no one could possibly have gone inside. It's brilliant.
It's vivid, unforgettable storytelling. And why a spider web? Because it's a miracle of the natural world that a peasant farmer or a laborer could easily understand and verify.
That makes total sense.
And Paulinus also documented intense local miracles, like exorcisms and healings.
Oh, the lamp hook. There is a visceral story in the poems about a monk named Therasia. He's working, and he accidentally gets a metal lamp hook caught directly in his eye.
Ouch, yeah.
It is a horrific, wince-inducing industrial accident. But the poem details how Therasia prays to Felix, pulls the hook out, and his eye is miraculously washed clean and perfectly healed by his own tears.
And again, an industrial accident with a lamp hook is something the working-class people of Nola intimately understood. But Paulinus didn't just rely on poetry. He was a major pioneer in using visual art for what the church calls catechesis.
Which is essentially basic religious instruction, right?
Exactly.
He commissioned these massive, elaborate series of paintings all along the porticos of the shrine of St. Felix. He explicitly wrote that his goal was to use these images to, quote, awaken interest in their astonished minds.
Yeah, he knew his audience.
He really did. He knew the peasants coming to the shrine couldn't read his letters or his high-minded theology, so he built them a graphic novel.
Which was a deeply empathetic, strategic approach to pastoral care.
But I want to look at the mechanics of this. When you combine the upgraded infrastructure, the annual poetry events, the intense visual arts, Paulinus is basically acting like a modern PR genius.
Absolutely.
He's using multimedia to launch St. Felix from a local hero into global fame. But did the wider church actually like this? Was it normal to use highly decorated art as mass education? Or was Paulinus an outlier getting pushback?
He was definitely an innovator, and he absolutely got pushback.
Really?
Oh, yeah. In the early church, there was a lot of anxiety about highly decorated spaces because they felt too close to pagan temples. Not everyone was on board.
I see.
But what we see here is how highly educated, artistically minded people like Paulinus and Therasia were crucial in bridging a gap. They took abstract theological concepts, grace, salvation, divine intervention, and translated them into accessible physical formats.
They democratized it.
Exactly. They essentially turned Nola into a localized hub of worship that spoke the visual language of the common person. And the long-term effectiveness of that visual strategy cannot be overstated.
It really can. We know that this exact strategy of visual catechesis, using art to teach the faith, is what profoundly moved figures like St. Elizabeth Ann Seton 1,500 years later.
Right.
She wrote about being captivated by Catholic art in Italy. The strategy Paulinus deployed in the 300s was still converting people centuries later.
It speaks to a fundamental human need for a tangible, visual connection to the divine. And because of this incredible work, the local people of Nola absolutely revered Paulinus. His influence grew to the point where, by sheer popular demand, he was elevated to the role of Bishop of Nola in the year 409.
And he guided that diocese for over 2 decades. But his later years were anything but peaceful, because this is the era of the Vandal invasions.
Yes, a very dark time.
The Roman world is actively crumbling around them. A bishop at this time isn't just a spiritual guide. They are the de facto mayor, the crisis manager, the last line of defense.
Yeah, they had to do everything.
And there is a very famous story about his time as bishop, which was later recorded by St. Gregory the Great.
It is perhaps the most defining legend of his entire life.
The story goes that a poor widow comes to Bishop Paulinus in desperate tears. Her only son has been taken captive by the invading Vandals, specifically by the son-in-law of the Vandal king.
Right.
She begs Paulinus to pay the ransom to get her son back. But Paulinus has already given away everything. He liquidated his estates decades ago, and he has spent whatever was left in the church's treasury feeding the refugees. He had zero money.
Nothing left to give.
Nothing. So he looks at the widow and says, "Such as I have, I will give." And he offers himself to be traded to the Vandals as a slave in the boy's place.
It is the absolute pinnacle of self-sacrifice.
And the narrative says he actually goes through with it. He goes to Africa. He works in the dirt as a gardener for the Vandal king's family.
Yeah.
He stays in slavery until one day the king discovers his true identity as this universally respected bishop. And the king is so moved by the sheer humility of the act that he frees Paulinus, and as a bonus, frees all the enslaved townsmen of Nola to return home with him.
It's an incredible cinematic story.
But we have to ask,
What's
did that actually happen?
Right.
Because historical records, and even modern figures like Pope Benedict XVI, note that the historical truth of this exact ransom episode is highly disputed.
That is correct. It is what historians call hagiography writings about saints that are meant to highlight their spiritual heroism and inspire awe, rather than act as a strict factual biography. As with many figures of late antiquity, literal historical fact and hagiographical legend often blur together.
It's similar to the bell story, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Because Paulinus is traditionally credited with inventing the use of bells in Christian church services. The region is Campania, the town is Nola, and later medieval bells were literally named campanas and nolas after the area.
Right.
But again, scholars say there's no hard evidence he actually introduced them. It's more of a persistent cultural myth. So what does this all mean? If we know the Vandal ransom story might be fiction and the bell invention is likely a myth, does that diminish his actual legacy?
So this raises an important question about how we should read ancient history. We are obsessed with literal forensic facts today.
Right, receipt-driven.
Exactly. But in late antiquity, the core truth of a person's character was very often preserved through these larger-than-life stories. The logistical details of the Vandal ransom might be stretched, but the moral truth remains perfectly intact.
Makes sense.
The fact that an entire society attached these specific, hyper-empathetic legends to Paulinus proves something undeniable. It proves that his profound generosity, his radical empathy, and his willingness to sacrifice his elite status left a mark on the human psyche that mere historical footnotes could never capture.
He was the kind of man people wholeheartedly believed would sell himself into slavery to save a widow's son.
Exactly. And as Pope Benedict XVI noted, that story perfectly encapsulates his true legacy. He was a, quote, bishop with a great heart.
When you lay out the entire journey of Paulinus and Therasia, the sheer scale of their transformation is staggering. A devastating personal loss leads them to abandon immense wealth and the highest tiers of Roman political power.
Yeah.
But rather than vanishing into the woods, they leverage an agonizingly slow, high-stakes postal system to build a network of the greatest minds of their era.
They didn't reject the world, they re-engaged with it on entirely new terms. They used their intellect and their remaining resources, not for their own political advancement, but to build a legacy blending art, poetry, and profound charity. They commissioned paintings to educate the illiterate, they fed the poor during invasions, and they fundamentally altered how the early church communicated its message.
It changes how you view communication entirely. The next time you tap out a quick text message or hit send out an email, maybe take a second to think about the immense logistical effort, the physical risk, and the sheer artistry it took to maintain a relationship across the ancient world.
Yeah. They didn't have instant gratification, they had extreme patience. And they had bearers who risked their lives to carry a message across an ocean.
Indeed. Understanding the friction of their world forces us to reflect on the weight and the value of our own words today. We started this conversation by talking about how an ancient letter wasn't just data. It was viewed as a physical extension of the sender's body, a piece of their very soul, an intimate artifact that someone might walk for weeks just to deliver.
It's beautiful, really.
It is. So, we will leave you with this final thought to mull over today. If all of our frictionless, instant digital communication were to completely vanish tomorrow, which of your messages would actually be profound enough to warrant someone walking hundreds of miles to deliver it as a living letter?